Hi everyone, welcome back to another day of Inktoberfest. This is Kimberly from KimmyB16 and I'm here to show you how to re-ink your ink pads properly. I have a wide assortment of ink pads here to show you. I have embossing ink, dye ink, a solvent ink, pigment ink, and a mix of dye and pigment. You will see the refill technique is pretty much similar for all of them. I'm going to start with my Color Hive embossing ink. This pad is a foam pad and the refill is very thick, which will sit on the top of the pad longer. So for the first step, I'm going to generously ink the pad in a zigzag motion over the whole pad. Then I will give it a few seconds to absorb into the pad. Next, you can use a gift card, an acrylic block, or a palette knife. I'm going to use a palette knife to spread the ink evenly over the whole pad so it will move around to the areas that are more dry and absorb into the pad uniformly. As you can see, I accidentally stamped on my clear pad with an unclean stamp. So to fix that, I dabbed off the top with a paper towel to get as much of the black ink off and then refilled it. And it stamps just fine now. So my clear pad is refilled, and I would like to suggest that when you purchase an ink pad that you get the refill to go with it, because you never know when you're going to end up running out of ink. Next, I'm going to go over the dye inks. All three of these are dye inks with a felt type of pad, but they all have different uses. The archival ink is permanent, and it's great to use for stamping when you're going to watercolor the image, or when you will be using it along with distress ink that may be spritzed with water. The archival ink will not run or bleed if it gets wet. Distress inks are dye inks that are water reactive and are known for their blending qualities and pretty ink smushed backgrounds. Memento is also a dye ink, but it will run if it gets wet. It dries quick and is great for using with Copic and other alcohol markers. The only real difference when refilling these is the eyedropper in the distress refill, but you still refill it the same way. So the refill for the dye ink is much thinner than the embossing ink. You will see that it seeps into the pad much quicker than the embossing ink did. I'm going to start the same way by squeezing the refill in a zigzag motion over the whole pad. And as I do, the pad is sucking that ink right in. You can see one side is almost absorbed already. I think this pad was really thirsty. So I'm just going to add a little more ink, and as I set it down for a second, the ink is already absorbed into that pad. Pigment ink sits on the top of your cardstock, which makes both of these inks great for embossing. Distress Oxide is a mix of dye ink and pigment ink, but it still has the water reactive properties that distress inks have. The pigment ink pad has a spongy pad, and the ink is much thicker than the dye ink. The distress pad has a felt pad, and the ink is more like the consistency of dye ink. As you can see with this Oxide refill, the ink separates. It is important to make sure you mix the refill well before filling your pad. You can see when I refill the pad in a zigzag, the ink is so thin it runs together. So once I have gone over the top completely with the ink, I will let it sit for a few seconds. And then I'm going to get my palette knife and I'm going to push the ink evenly into the pad. It's a good idea to let your ink pads sit for about 20 minutes before using them after you have refilled them. I am going to fill the pigment ink the same as the Oxide. As you can see, the pigment ink is much thicker than the dye and pigment mix of the Oxide. As I'm zigzagging over the pad, I am pressing some of the ink in with the nozzle. Once I am done inking the pad, and I let it sit for a few seconds, I will use my palette knife to spread this ink evenly over the pad. One of the qualities that I love about pigment ink is that it maintains its vibrant color when stamping on dark cardstock. Stazon is a solvent ink which is great to stamp on non-porous surfaces such as glass, ceramic, and acetate, because it evaporates quickly, allowing it to dry on those surfaces. However, that also allows for the pad to dry out quicker. So it's important to keep the clear plastic cover that comes with the pad on at all times when not in use. I've attached mine to the lid with foam tape to make it easier to remove when I'm stamping with it. Stazon has a felt pad and the ink is thin, so it applies very easy. You can see it absorb into the pad quickly, and because of this, you do not need to go over it with anything to distribute the ink over the pad. Now, can you overfill an ink pad? Of course you can. As you can see here, the ink is not absorbing into the pad, so I'm going to try to push it in with my gift card. I can tell it is over inked because the gift card is not pushing the ink into the pad, it's just moving the puddle around the top. So I am going to just scrape off the ink sitting on the top with the gift card and wipe it off on a towel. I'm going to repeat this 2 more times until the ink is not pulling on the top anymore. If that were Distress ink or any water reactive ink, I would have smushed it onto my mat and made a few ink smushed backgrounds so I didn't waste the ink. The last pad I would like to refill for you is a color Hive pad. Color Hive pads are foam pads. I knew this ink pad needed to be refilled, but you can see in the center that the ink is a little lighter, which can also be an indicator that it needs to be refilled. Generally, we tend to use the center of our pads more for stamping and ink blending, so it's not a surprise to me that this is where the ink would dry out before the edge. So the same thing, you would mix it up, which I've already done a bunch of times because I don't know why, I just like sitting there and shaking it. And you're going to do the same thing. I am going to make sure that I apply the ink on all sides. I did speed up this part so you do not see that I did let it sit for a few seconds before using the palette knife to push the ink into the pad. Now for our tag. I had stamped this image before refilling the Purple Rain ink pad so you could see the before and after. I strongly suggest you getting an ink refill when you buy your ink pad. You really don't want a chance running out of ink in the middle of a project. What a big difference the re-inked pad made. When I first started stamping forever ago, I only used ink for stamping and to paint images in with a water brush, so I didn't always buy the refill. Now with ink blending, ink smushing, stenciling, and ink swiping, there are so many more reasons to have a refill on hand. You really cannot mess up refilling your ink pad. If you don't put enough on, you can always add more. If you add too much, I showed you how to remove the excess. And the most important tip I have is to use the right refill for the right ink pad. So just to recap, I'm just going to write on the tag what we did here. This was the before. This was the after we refilled it. This is ink blended. This is ink swiped. And then the stages of re-inking your pad would be, the first step, you want to generously zigzag, refill over pad. 2, you want to let the pad rest 30 to 60 seconds. Number 3, you want to distribute the ink. With a palette knife, or you could use your gift card, or you could use the stamp block. 4, you want to let it rest. Approximately 20 minutes before stamping. And then 5, you want to make sure that you keep your lid on your ink pads secure. So that they don't dry out unnecessarily. So I hope that you liked my tutorial, and please come back tomorrow to see the next Inktober video. Have a great day.